Thank you very much, all of you. Thanks for coming. And yeah, UQFIO, you could say that. It's kind of like I feel like a UFO acronym. But it's really great to be here in Denmark with you guys. I really like what your group is really cool, really good. And I appreciate you all coming out on this wet, cold, Baltic winter. And, it's, you wouldn't get anyone in England out in weather like this, I'll tell you. We used to rain, but not cold like this. It's I know some of you. I know Pia, of course, and I've met Carsten, and I've known you, Pia, for a while, and Michael there I've known as well from Facebook. But now I have proven he exists because I've actually met Michael. Okay, so let me tell you a bit more about myself. As you just heard, hello, hiya. Oh, come in. Another skeptic. They're everywhere, aren't they? My name is Ben Emlyn-Jones, and if you want to know anything about me, I have this website here, HAPANWO, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order, and you'll find all various different links to that, to the various things I do, including my books here, which you can buy today if you like. I'll tell you more about those later on. But that's my basic website, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order. And the reason I called it that was because that was me, the portering Buddha. I was a hospital porter for 23 years, and I lost my job. I got kicked out of the National Health Service, and someone actually asked me about that, and well, I can't go into details now because it's a very long story, but it was suspicious. I found that a lot of people, specifically people in government service of various kinds, or in the church, like the priesthood, have been got into trouble through their employment because of their interests in the subjects we talk about here, and the subjects I'm going to talk about today. Specifically, like in health service, policemen, military, government people, politicians and people like that have found themselves in terrible trouble inexplicably for these kinds of interests. But never mind, I'm now an ex-hospital porter, so be it, I can move on. Now, we're talking about British UFO cases. I actually thought of a better title after the one I chose, which I'll give you at the end, which I'm going to call it next time I present this. But this is the country we're talking about, basically. Britain, the United Kingdom. I don't know how people in your country are with geography. I know the Americans are terrible. I know how they collude. Sorry, Marcello. They think it's Western Canada or something. But this is the country we're talking about, the United Kingdom, or Britain. This is actually 4 countries in one, hence united. They were united in several phases. England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And these are 4 countries. They all have their own customs, they have their own languages. You can speak English anywhere though in them. And I live in Oxford, which is in England, but I actually come from Wales. And then my surname, Emlyn-Jones, is a very Welsh name. I'll be talking to you about a case from Wales, because Wales has actually got more than its fair share of the best UFO cases in Britain. For that, probably the second smallest after Northern Ireland of the constituent nations of the UK. But really has the lion's share of the UFO hotspots, I would say. Interestingly, you can just see where Denmark is there on the right, just poking out. That's where Denmark is in relation to Britain. Denmark actually ruled half of this for several centuries, a long time ago. And it was a long time ago, and all is forgiven.
You need us back now.
No hard feelings at all. Sending us Sandy Toksvig is another matter. I still owe you for that. But this is the country we're talking about today. Now, in terms of our country's relationship to the UFO phenomenon, it's different from those in Scandinavia, and I can't speak specifically for Denmark, and I don't want to get into trouble by saying, this, because I know that Denmark is a country. Scandinavia is like a collective word for a whole load of countries in Northern Europe. 3 countries, and Finland is. I thought Finland was, but it's not. 3 countries in Northern Europe. But I know specifically Sweden. I can't say for Denmark. Sweden itself, I know, has a much longer relationship with this phenomenon than Britain does, because I was at the British UFO Research Association had a conference where Klaas Svahn spoke. He is a guy from Sweden who talks a lot about UFOs, and he did a talk about the history of UFOs in Scandinavia. Well, he mentioned that there was these ghost rockets and aerial interceptions going back to 1930 or so, We didn't have that in Britain, although the UFO phenomenon is perennial. It's, in other words, it is something that's always been a part of human experience. And you can't really, by going through history, you can't really find a beginning of it on a folk level. But on an official level, there is a beginning. And for Britain, it is later than maybe in this part of the world, specifically Sweden, I know. And it really can be traced back to this guy. Do you recognise him? Mm-hmm. Mm. Winston Churchill. Now he is our most famous Prime Minister because he's a wartime Prime Minister. But he was very interested in space and technology, and he actually, there's some new letters that he actually wrote to a newspaper that were never actually published by the paper that have recently come to light, and they have been published just a couple of years ago, 54 years after he died. And it's been revealed that he had a keen interest in all things up there and strange, including, even before the war, the UFO phenomenon. Now, in World War II, there were a lot of reports of strange things being seen in the sky, especially by Royal Air Force crews. They would actually encounter what they called Foo Fighters, which is the word that they used for UFOs. These could be anything from large structured craft to small lights. There's some footage of lights, and there's several theories about what these are. But there was some interest, we know, going back to at least 1952, of a flying saucer investigation, official flying saucer investigations, organised by this chap here, and several senior military officers would talk about this. And what he said was very interesting, because they referred to the Foo Fighters phenomenon, and also several other contemporary sightings. I'm going to talk to you about one involving the Royal Air Force in a minute. But he said something very strange, Churchill. He reported that this phenomenon, which you see flying above his head here, this is a composite picture, by the way, it's not real. This wasn't a real. But he did actually have this is an illustration of what he was thinking. This should be kept classified, strictly classified, for at least 50 years. And probably longer, he probably meant longer than that as well, because he was concerned that it would cause public panic. And this is a curious thing for Churchill to say in 1952, so soon after World War II, because in World War II, Britain was bombed by the Germans. They bombed cities, and a lot of us had to go over and fight, and 300,000 men were killed in the war. People were killed in the Blitz. There were 60,000 people in London were killed in the Blitz. We had rationing because German U-boats were attacking any ships that were delivering goods from North America to Britain. And people didn't panic when that happened. The British public, they faced that danger very bravely. So whatever it was Churchill was concerned about, he regarded it as a greater threat or more frightening than the things people had just experienced a few years ago in the war. That's how seriously he regarded the UFO problem or phenomenon. And that is something I find very curious.
He was a Freemason as well.
Oh, yes, he was indeed, yes.
Huh.
Right. Now we come on to this chap. Everyone recognises him, don't they?
Yeah.
It is the one and only Nick Pope. You cannot go anywhere without seeing this guy. You can't have a UFO conference without inviting this guy. Well, you can, but it's considered improper. Yeah. Nick Pope. I can neither confirm nor deny that. We can't rule it out. These are always little catchphrases that. But he used to be the man you had on speed dial if you were in the media and you wanted to do a news story. One of the few news stories they ever did about UFOs, which were very rare in Britain. I can't say for the Danish media, but in Britain the UFO phenomenon is very rarely covered seriously, especially now. It's got worse actually in the last few years. If you go back maybe 20 years or so, you did get a couple of serious programs about UFOs, and this guy was on them. Now you get nothing. They're just sort of comedy documentaries really, and it's very frustrating if you do want to take these things seriously and you can't laugh about it to watch these particular programs. I've been asked to take part in a couple of British documentaries on UFOs, and I said no way, or words to that effect. But Nick Pope actually was a civil servant. He was in the Ministry of Defence, and he ran the UFO desk. It's Air Secretariat AS2A, catchy little name. And that was his UFO desk, and he ran that. And basically, his job was to officially investigate UFO sightings. He was an official government ufologist, one of the few following in the footsteps of, say, J. Allen Hynek and people like that. And it's interesting that the things such as Project Blue Book and its various other projects in the United States seems to have been basically a source of disinformation. And I suspect that this guy's involved in something similar. I can't prove it, but his behaviour and the things he said leads me not to trust this man. Definitely no. He has since left the Ministry of Defence. He's now working as an independent journalist. He's living in America with an American wife. And he's basically been replaced in his status in the media, his position in the media has been replaced by a guy called Dr. David Clarke. I don't know how many of you have heard of him? You up here has, yeah, we were talking about him before. He just basically is a complete debunker. But he's now the go-to guy for public UFOs. He's a historian of folklore at Sheffield Hallam University. Says it all really, doesn't it? Boy's crying in the wilderness, and sadly he passed away without anyone, without. Now, the United Kingdom, Britain, is famous primarily for this one incident. I mean, in global ufology, this is the Rendlesham Forest Incident. It's one of the world's biggest and most important UFO sightings, involving multiple people, official documentation. It's impossible to deny, because of the number of witnesses and the way the government responds, which dates back almost contemporarily. It doesn't sort of, you don't wait 30 years and then start speaking up like with Roswell. This started almost the public, thanks to people like Dot Street and Brenda Butler and Jenny Randalls. This was, and several other people, Larry Warren, and it was a whole team of people. This basically hit the public sphere very, very soon after it happened, and it became impossible to deny. But the Rendlesham Forest Incident is not the only one of its kind, and there are others which I think are maybe equally significant. And then they're much less well known. In fact, it's an exclusive. One of the events I'm going to talk about has not been talked about yet outside Britain. And so this is an exclusive. And I'm going to discuss some of those cases today. Some of them you might have heard of. They have been reported reasonably well outside of Britain, but others I'm betting you've not heard of. I doubt if anyone in this room has heard of every single case I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I really do. Britain is also famous for these crop circles. This is the famous Eastfield Formation from 1990. Now, these formations in the field can be traced back a long way, several centuries in fact. But really in the 1970s they took off, and they were centred on the West Country of England. That's the part, if you remember the map I showed you, it's the part just to the south and east of Wales within England. That is the West Country of England, which has a reputation for strangeness and the supernatural. That's where all the stone circles are and things like that. And the crop circles appeared in that area primarily, and they still do. They're still centred on that region. However, they can be found all over the country, and indeed all over the world. You know what they are? Some of them are made by people. A large proportion are made by people with tools, with normal tools. And I know a couple of people who make them. But I've talked to these people. I don't call them names and I don't get angry with them. I just talk to them. It's pretty clear that their activities, and they will admit it when you finally corner them on this subject, even they will admit their activities cannot account for all crop circles. It does not account for the entire phenomenon. Something else is going on here. There's a lot of some research being done into crop circles that could not have been made using the methods that the plankers, as we call them, are made. Plankers is actually a derogatory term. It rhymes with a rude word in English, but they don't mind. They don't mind. They even call themselves that sometimes. So this is a very, very interesting thing. Again, it's a British. It's associated with England and Britain, but it's worldwide. Now this is a case. It's a story. It's a bit of a small slide, but basically, you're looking out an aircraft window, and there are 3 white blobs of light. This is the little Rissington UFO incident from October 1952. Now there was an aircraft flying. It's a Royal Air Force aircraft, a training aircraft, a Meteor jet, and it's being flown by a guy called William Swinney, who was a flight lieutenant in the RAF, and he was training a Royal Navy officer called David Crofts. And the 2 men both saw this. They were flying at 12,000 feet, and they looked up, saw 3 objects, circular objects, glowing white, oval-shaped or saucer-shaped. At first, Swinney thought they were a parachute, and he thought there were 3 guys coming down on parachutes. So he turned the aircraft to get out the way, so they wouldn't hit the parachutes. And then these things followed them. They moved in synchronicity with the aircraft, as if almost immediately, as if they knew exactly where the aircraft was moving. And Swinney and Crofts both saw these objects, and they reported them. And here, this is a page from Lieutenant Swinney's log. And you can see here, saucers! And I can't read that, his writing there's a bit indistinct. But this is the date here, October 21st, this is 1952. Saucers! Funnily enough, when the 2 men landed, they were confined to quarters, and they were ordered by their commanding officer, ordered them not to leave their quarters. They said, all your food will be brought to you. You're not allowed to talk to anyone else on the base. And then, literally, within hours, some strange men arrived in dark suits, you know the classic trope, the dark suits and things like that. They didn't introduce themselves, they just said, they mentioned these objects had been picked up on radar on another base, and they just asked them a few questions like that, and they said, you mustn't talk about this. I mean, they have spoken out about it, indeed there's been an official report released, but they were told, it's interesting that as long ago as 1952, this takes us back to Churchill and the Flying Saucers Working Party. As long ago as 1952, not only was actions taken against this particular event, but it appears that the government already had a procedure in place for dealing with things like this, which means they must have had some experience of events that happened earlier. And that continues to this day, and I'll come back to that point. That's a very important point, that these men turned up, the men who turned up to interview Swinney and Crofts seemed to know what they were talking about and know what they were doing, as if they've done this before. What's next? Now this is a very interesting photograph here. This was taken on 25th of May 1964 by a guy called Jim Templeton. Now he's a man who lives in Cumbria, which is right on the north of England, just near the border of Scotland. And he went out on one Saturday afternoon with his family, his wife Annie, and his daughter Elizabeth, to a place called Brough Marsh, which is an area of wetland and moorland near the Solway Firth, which is a large body of water between England and Scotland. And he's a keen amateur photographer, and so he took a number of photographs, including these portraits of his daughter holding a posy of flowers. She's got a new dress on. And he took 3 photographs of this, like good photographers do, just like changing the exposure settings occasionally, but he took them all within a few seconds. In the second one, not the first or second shot, not in the first and third one, but in the middle shot, the second shot, you see this strange figure, because he only found out when he went to the chemists to get these developed. And I mean, anyone younger than me is going, what? But believe it or not, you used to have to do this. You had to take the film to the chemist shop, and then only then would you get the prints back. You couldn't just upload them to Facebook like you do nowadays. So he's the guy at the chemist shop, and it's a shame that the guy in the beekeeper's suit ruined that photograph. He must have just walked behind you. And Jim Templeton said, no one else was there. And he said nobody was there, it was just him, Annie, and the little girl, Elizabeth. have a closer look at that image. This is a bit of a blow-up of that. You see, there's Elizabeth. Now this thing behind is vaguely humanoid. It's like the top half of a humanoid figure. Now, he's been accused of faking this, even though he took it to Kodak, the people who made the film, the famous film company, and they was absolutely convinced that this was not fake. It'd be very, very difficult to fake this image because you have like a layering problem here. Do you notice there's a strand of hair coming from Elizabeth's crown that goes in front of the object? And you can see the object through, in between the strand of hair. Now, very often when you do these kinds of fakes, these things would be behind, the strand of hair would be behind the entity, and it would be obviously, you could see that it was a composite image. But this is not the case. And Kodak have offered a lifetime supply of film to anyone who can prove this is fake, and no one ever has done. This image, it's a strange figure. I mean, you can't tell if it looks as if this looks like the chest. Yet, and that could be like a helmet with a visor. It doesn't look like a thing a beekeeper would wear, a big white suit. But look at the arm. The arm has the elbow pointing forward, as if the arm is facing backwards. It reminds me of that famous painting of the Son of Man painting, the man with the hat and the apple in front of his face. Do you know the one I mean? It's a famous painting, and his art, you see the same thing, the elbow backwards. Now, very, very odd, and this was at the time was a big media sensation all over the world. It died down after that. But this is a recent photograph. Oops, no, sorry, I'll come to that in a minute. I'll come to the other photograph in a minute. But this there's a bit of a strange connection here because this is a Blue Streak missile being tested at the Woomera test range in Australia. This is a British nuclear missile that was being developed at the time. And in May 1964, they were doing some test firings of this rocket. I think they were testing the engines. Now this is not a photograph of the strange event that happened, but this is a reconstruction of it. You can see two guys down here. And this is very, very similar. One of the test launches was something odd happened because they were about to fire the rocket engines and they said they had to stop because there were two men wandering around on the launch pad. And they'd been burnt by the jet exhaust, the rocket exhaust, if they'd actually fired the engines then. So they cancelled the test, but they went up there and they couldn't find anyone, even though they'd seen it. They'd seen it through the viewing system they had. Now these two guys on the launch pad, they thought they were just members of the team, but they made sure everyone was away from the rocket when they actually fired it because they had to do head count and everything. You had to do that with these things. So they thought, who are these two guys? And they couldn't find them. But they were dressed in a big white suit, similar to what Jim Templeton had seen. And the Blue Streak missile was tested in Australia, but a lot of its components were developed at Dounreay. And if you go back to the original image, I think you have to go to this one, yeah. You can just stand, you can just see it, it's easier to see it on this one. There's a kind of dome-shaped structure there. That is the nuclear power station at Dounreay. You can actually see it, it doesn't come out very clearly in this print, but in other prints you can see it. It's actually in view in the shot. And here's just a recent, you can actually see it better in that, you can actually see it better in this print. You see that little white building? That's the Dounreay nuclear power station, which is where they was also involved in the weapons program where they helped develop the Blue Streak missile. Now this is a recent piece. This was taken, Jim Templeton died in 2011 and this photograph was taken just before he died. Elizabeth there, you can see, is a big girl now. And there she is holding the print of herself as a child. Now these two people, and indeed Annie, the wife before she died, they stuck by their story. They never confessed to hoaxing anything. And the strange thing is Jim Templeton, just after he took the photograph, he had some strange visitors by two guys who said they worked from the government, and they were wearing dark black suits, sunglasses, trilby hats. Yeah, they looked exactly like you suspect when you think of the Men in Black. But this was at a time before the concept of Men in Black had really entered the popular culture. John Keel hadn't written about it, certainly not Nick Redfern, and the other people who'd been studying the Men in Black phenomenon. It hadn't been addressed. So how would Jim Templeton make this up? Anyway, they didn't introduce themselves. They just referred to each other by numbers. And they took Jim. He got in the back of their car and they drove him to Brough Marsh and they demanded. They were quite bullish, intimidating people like these guys tend to do. and they said, show us where you took this photograph, and he took them over to the spot where he took the photograph. And they said something very strange. They said, did you see the second alien?
Yeah.
The second alien. They said, and he said, I didn't see anyone, and I took a photograph of this one thing here. So what second alien are they talking about? Anyway, they got very angry with him because he couldn't provide any answers. And they drove off and left him on Brough Marsh. He had to walk 10 miles home back to Carlisle, where he lives. Very strange case indeed. As is the one I'm going to talk about now. This is a local case from the Emerald of the South, that's Oxfordshire. This happened not far from where I live. It's very, very odd indeed. This is a newspaper photo, as you can probably gather. I think it's a bit comical. Which is from the Oxford Mail. That there is Mike Soper. I've spoken to this guy. He's a local ufologist from Oxford. There are more than one of us, luckily. And he investigated a very interesting case, which I did report on in UFO Truth magazine. It involves somebody who goes by the name of David Mann. Now, if you speak English, David Mann and are familiar with English names, David Mann is a very normal name. It's a very common name indeed in Britain. Almost as common as the names you can get. And the reason is it's not his real name. The witness who came forward to Mike Soper never insisted that no one ever reveals his real name. But the reason is because he was, I don't know if he's still alive now, but he was a lecturer at the Oxford Brookes University, which used to be called the Oxford Polytechnic. So he was a senior academic. Not at the famous Oxford University, but as another one. And he was worried it would harm his career. If anyone found out about it, they think he was crazy. So I don't know who the witness is. But I know he lived in Oxford, or maybe he still does. In 1978, he was driving home from Gloucester, which is a journey to Oxford with his family, his wife and 2 children. This is a journey which should take about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the traffic. But this was late at night. It was about 9 p.m, so it should have only taken an hour, maybe a bit more. And he was driving just west of Oxford along a little road. And something strange happened. And he only found out when he got home, and he saw that he looked at the clock and saw it was midnight. So it had taken about 3.5 hours to drive home from Gloucester. He thought, that's odd. What's happened? And he told his story, which is actually very similar to a case probably most of you familiar with, the Betty and Barney Hill case from the United States, the so-called first alien abductees. Well, they're not, but they're the first to be widely publicised. And the memories came back to the family over the course of a few days. They began to remember things that happened on their journey. He was driving along this road near Farringdon in Oxfordshire, just west of Oxford, and he kept seeing the same things passing by at the side of the road, the same landmarks, as if he was on some kind of racing circuit. And he stopped the car, well, the engine cut out. It just stopped of its own accord. And a strange craft landed, flying saucer landed in the field next door. And these strange people approached, and he said they looked human. They looked like humans. They were masculine, sort of blondish hair, like Nordic type men, and they had strange clothes on, and they communicated telepathically. They just through their thoughts, and their eyes were a strange shape, and they were too high up on the head. But apart from that, they looked human. And they told the family they had to come on board the craft, and they went on board this craft, which is about 100 feet across. Although based on what they found inside, it's as if the inside was even bigger. It's like Doctor Who's TARDIS, bigger on the inside. And the family was split up. The children had to go in one direction, and the parents went in another. The children were subjected to medical examinations, whereas the mother and father were shown the engines of the craft, and there was like these big levers, like an old-fashioned railway signal box. And the captain, the man they called the captain, because he seemed to be in charge, told Mr. Mann and his family that it worked on something that was called natural energy propulsion. And he said that humans shouldn't use nuclear power because it's bad for the environment, and he gave him a bit of a lecture about that. And then eventually the family were reunited, and they were allowed to disembark from the craft. And they went home. Now, Mike, this is Mike Soper, he's absolutely convinced that this is a genuine case. He's investigated it thoroughly. The family, Mr. Mann, has no reason to make this up. In fact, he's avoiding publicity he guards his anonymity very carefully. He's never ever gone public with what he said. We know, all we know is his background. He works at the Oxford Polytechnic. But I thought it was a very interesting case indeed, the closest one to my home. Now, we're going to come on to a very interesting case now. It's much more recent. In fact, it's only 3 years old. Happened just under 3 years ago. Now, this is the first time anyone has spoken about this particular incident outside the United Kingdom ever. And a week ago, just over a week ago, I received a strange phone call at my home from someone who I don't know, and who basically told me, he didn't threaten me, but he said, it would be a good idea not to talk about this subject. Come in here. I think he didn't say it was because I was coming to Denmark to talk about it, but the timing of it all seems a bit strange. And then he put the phone down. I have no idea who he is. And my phone number's extraterrestrial, so how he got the number, I don't know. He basically said I shouldn't talk about this. But I'm going to talk about it. The Penter Ufo. Now, this is an event which happened on the 26th of February 2016. And I'm indebted to these two people for what I'm going to talk about today. That's Gary Jones, who's a field researcher from South Wales. And there's Kaz Clark, who is the first and only witness to go public so far. But there are others in the area we're talking about. The Penter is a village. It's a small village in South Wales, just north of Cardiff, the capital city. And it's very hilly around there. There's a lot of hills and valleys. It's typical of South Wales. And it's a small village on the side of what's called Garth Mountain. And a number of people had reported a very, very strange experience there. And I'm just, here's another pic. This is me here with Kaz Clark. And this is at the location where this event happened. Now, it's odd because there was, the activity started about 3 days before the sighting of the strange object. But large number of aircraft were flying over the village. Including what we know is an RAF reconnaissance aircraft, which is often used for. It's basically a spy plane, which is often used, and you often see it in conjunction with UFO events. But Kaz Clark and her neighbours were getting fed up with this because these aircraft were flying over the village at low altitude over and over again. There's some helicopters, there's some jet aircraft, propeller planes, everything, and it was continuous. And they phoned the police. The police didn't know anything about it. They called the Ministry of Defence. They didn't say anything about it. They wouldn't tell them anything about it. And what happened was one man couldn't sleep at night because of the noise made by these continuous overflying of the aircraft. And so the neighbours were sitting up in the garden on a Thursday night watching the aircraft flying over. And eventually they saw a red light appear in the sky. And they thought, what the hell's that? And so they went out of their houses, and a huge crowd of them, about 5 of them, came up to this gate here by a field at the edge of the village to see what was going on. They wanted to see what was happening. And here's a picture of the same place looking from the other direction. So they looked over here, where the red light was in the sky, above, in the night sky. It was the early hours of the morning. And the red light became more than one light. It became 2, then 3. And a whole group of red lights appeared in the shape of a pyramid or triangle, and it was huge. It was enormous. We can actually gauge the size because we know virtually where it touched down, because it did come very close to the ground and it left a mark on the ground. So we know it was it must have been several hundred feet across. It was enormous, black, dark. It was illuminated by its own lights around it, and several other objects broke off from it or came out of it. Green barrel-shaped objects about the size of a family car, and these hovered over the hedge there and above the tree here. They changed colour from red to green, and Kaz was looking up and she waved like that at this barrel-shaped object. And when she said that, I thought there was something very convincing about that, the way she said it, and it sounded sincere to me. And indeed, there's other reasons to think that she's telling the truth. So the Swansea UFO Network investigated that, and Gary now helped them. He now investigates them independently, and as you can see, he's put these things on here. Now this is a good idea doing this because it helps with publicity and things like that. UFO activity area. There's another one here. This is on the gate. The Penter Ufo Incident. So it's putting the whole thing on the map. But so that's what happened. They saw this thing for about 2 minutes and it faded away. And very strange things happened because there was a large aircraft came. It was actually an E-3 Sentry aircraft, which is it is actually a military reconnaissance aircraft, and it flew very, very low over the village at the time this object appeared. And this was the culmination of about 3 days of activity by aircraft, which is extremely odd. It's as if, for somehow, the government knew something strange was going to happen in that area. They didn't know exactly where, but they knew they had a rough area, a kind of a guess of the various regions where this might happen, because they were covering all of South Wales with these aircraft. Indeed, they crossed over the sea between the southwest peninsula, which is Devon, Cornwall, the southwest peninsula of Britain, and they flew around there as well, and they flew back again. So they knew something was going to happen somewhere in that area, but they didn't know exactly where. They weren't sure. Now this is another view you can see here of the whole area. Now these hedges are very interesting because this is Gary here pointing towards one. Now this was the hedge above which the barrel-shaped object appeared. Now you can see from the previous picture I showed you, there's some foliage on the hedges. Now it's easier to see this in the summer when there's more foliage and there's more greenery, but you can see in November when I took these photographs, this bit of hedge here is dead. Above where the barrel-shaped object appeared, it's completely dead. It hasn't ever since that event happened 3 years ago. There's been not a shoot on it since. Now this is going along the pathway which leads through that field to another field they call the second field. And if you look to your right when you go to the end of that field, you see where one of the points of that pyramidal-shaped object, that huge pyramidal-shaped object, the size of a city block, where it touched down. This is enormous. It's as big as the Nye Credit building over there. It was that kind of building, that kind of size, just flying in the sky. And it touched down, and they call this the bald spot. You just see it. I couldn't visit it, unfortunately, when I was there, but you see a better view of it here. There's a patch there. They've got some photographs they haven't published yet, but I've seen them. Where again, there's nothing growing there. And you can see these two trees have been killed. They're dead. Now, what happened was when the object came close to the ground, there was some kind of what looked like an electrical discharge from the point closest to the ground to the ground. It looked like lightning bolts coming off this craft to the ground. I say looked like because it looked like an electrical discharge. It doesn't mean that's what it was. In fact, there's reason to believe it wasn't electrical discharge because there's no burn marks or anything like that. It's just as if the life has been sucked out of these trees and the grass behind it, which is really strange because these other trees are fine. The ones next to them, I mean, in the summertime you can see it better, but there's foliage here in November, just a little bit left. You can see they're fine. That gives us it's a very, very strange feature of this particular craft or this object that appeared, and it also allows us to judge its size because we know its range, we know where it was. Now, about just a day or two after this event. Now, do you remember the little Rissington case where those strange men turned up to interrogate the two pilots just immediately after the event? It happened again here, literally 2 days after, or even a day, I can't remember exactly, but very, very short time after this particular event occurred. This field here was suddenly full of people. And indeed, there was behind that row of trees there was a campsite. They tried to be discreet by putting them up behind a hedge, but everyone could see these tents. There was like rows and rows of tents, and there was a guard dog. He looked quite fierce. There was a guard dog that was was barked at anyone who came past. And Kaz walked her little. She got a little Jack Russell Terrier, and she had to pick because she walks her dog around there. She picked the doggy up because this big, I don't know, it was a mastiff or something, was barking at this little dog, and it was very, very strange indeed. And these people were wandering around this field here, and indeed the second field here, they wore white boiler suits, like police forensic teams, and some of them had red jackets on, and they were going up and down. There was about 20 of these people, she said. They had vehicles as well, like off-road vehicles, like Land Rovers, and they were not wearing any insignia or it wasn't a uniform as such, but we know that a couple of them were armed. they were carrying, well, she said there were two men dressed in combat utilities carrying rifles, and a couple of the others she saw had concealed carry holsters inside their jackets, you know. And she thought that was a bit odd. What were they doing around there? And so she went up and asked them, said, who are you? She asked one of the people, and they said, we're a fracking survey team. We're here to see if it's worth fracking in this area. And firstly, I don't know, there was no drilling rig or anything. And secondly, fracking is a very, very controversial thing indeed. And you can't, none of the people who do fracking can go anywhere without masses of protesters around them. They have to tell you in advance they're going to be there. There's usually a big protest. And so she asked one of the other ones, and honestly, they can't get their story straight. Because this guy said, oh, we're from a mobile phone network. And I said, she said, do you normally carry guns when you people from Vodafone? Do you normally carry guns? Are you normally armed? And they wouldn't answer her. Now I thought this before Kaz eventually showed me some photographs of these people or so, but I did wonder, you know, if I should get someone else, because Kaz was the only person who would speak to me. But I went into a local pub and I asked the barmaid behind the bar, and I said, do you remember this strange UFO thing? She says, yeah, I remember that. I didn't see anything, I was indoors, but I know some other people saw it. And what's more, she remembered these strange people. She thought they were filming Doctor Who. Because the Doctor Who TV series is often filmed in South Wales. It's based in the Cardiff BBC studios. And so she thought, oh, and that's who she thought they were, because there have been film crews in that area before. Again, as with Little Rissington, and indeed the next case I'm going to talk about as well, we had a situation where these people who turned up, these red-jacketed people with guns, they weren't just a case of the government, you know, saying, get some people to go and sort this out. What can we do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? A UFO's just appeared. We need someone to go and sort it out. Let's just get some people together and quickly. No. These were people who knew what they were doing. By that I mean they were a team that had been put together. They were, I'm guessing, a government department that already existed. A secret one. A secret government department that already exists. And when they turned up here at Penter, they was like this was just another job to them. They knew what they were doing already. This means they've done this sort of thing before. It means there is an existing team of people in the UK government put together to deal with UFOs and close encounters. Now, you won't see that on the Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget list. It's a black budget organisation, obviously. It's not on the official government inventory. But they were just too proficient. They seemed Kaz was saying they had these big pieces of equipment already set up. They had these big laptop things that were huge. She didn't know what they were, pieces of electronic equipment that looked like they were built for that particular purpose, and satellite dishes and things like that. This was a team that has done this before, and they were on another job. Now, this is the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. Now, we move a little way. We move 5 miles away from Penter now to a place called Llantrisant. Now, Penter is a small village. Llantrisant is quite a big town. And it's got a big industrial estate there where the Royal Mint is. And another researcher in Britain called Richard D. Hall has mistakenly concluded that the Penter incident was something connected to the Royal Mint and was some kind of drill. It wasn't. Now, I'm someone who was 23 years a hospital porter. I've been involved in military exercises because my hospital was used by the armed forces, and they used to practice landing helicopters and things like that to drop off patients from war zones and things like that. And we used to be involved in that. And I know for a fact that if they're going to do a military exercise anywhere, they have to tell people beforehand. And there's a lot of paperwork. They can't just say, oh, it was a military exercise afterwards, and you produced evidence that's obviously faked, as if they would pretend it was beforehand, especially when there's absolutely nothing at this hospital, and Kaz has investigated, and Gary, using the Freedom of Information Act, and it shows that there was no military drill here, and this hospital would have been involved because there was explosions nearby. In fact, there was an explosion that shook the entire building, which means they were detonating live ordnance. And that's something you don't do normally. And usually there's special defence training estates where this is done, where you use live ammunition, real bombs, real explosives. You don't normally do that sort of thing in a public area. If you were, everyone would know about it. Everyone in Llantrysant and indeed the surrounding area would know about it. There was a large explosion, just a couple of hours after the Penter incident. There was a large explosion here, just alongside this particular building, a place called Llantrysant Common, and it shook the building so hard. And Kaz spoke to several nurses and members of staff who remembered that night. And any kind of explosion near a hospital, it could be dangerous. I mean, you could have people having surgery or in intensive care, and the explosion could cause the computers to break down or something. Or it's got its own electricity supply, but it could cause computers to crash and things like that. Could kill people. Llantrysant Common is the area of waste ground next to this hospital, which is notorious for fly tipping. People they have lots of things they don't want to throw away, they don't want to pay the council to take them away. Old refrigerators, old cars that are off the road, rusty bicycles, things like that. And so they just take them to Llantrysant Common and they just leave them there. It's notorious, and the local people have been protesting the local authorities to clean it up. Get rid of all this rubbish, get rid of all these rusty metal fragments lying everywhere. And, well, they said they couldn't afford it, we'll sort of get round to it at some point. Well, anyway, the day after this explosion, the army moved in and did it. And they gathered up every piece of metal object on Llantrysant Common, all the rubbish, they piled it up at the side of the road and they took it away. So if you ever have a place like that near where you live, and you want it cleaned up, you have to get a UFO to land there. And I think there was some kind of landing or crash of some kind. I don't know exactly. Here's a map anyway. That is Penter over there. That's Llantrysant over here, just to the west. It just gives you, well, this is Llantrysant, the town. This is the hospital, and this is a place called Smilog Woods. I'll show you a photo of Smilog Woods. Looks spooky, doesn't it? That hill there with the woods on, that's called Smilog Woods. And something very, very odd happened there because this area was sealed off. This whole hillside was sealed off. And it's quite a popular recreational area. You get mountain bikers and people like that, and hikers go along there all the time. It was sealed off apparently because of a larch disease, which is a deadly disease of trees. And it's highly infectious. They didn't want people walking through there in case they picked it up on their boots and shoes and all the dog's paws, and they took it to another part of the wood and infected the trees there. The thing is, with larch disease, the procedure is very, very different because you have to leave it closed for much longer, and you have to go in and you have to foul all the infected trees and things like that. This wasn't done. Instead, this happened. An actual area of the forest was clear, not particular species of trees, but the entire area of this forest. This is about 300 feet across, this clearing that appeared just after the Penter incident. So something strange happened on this hillside at the same time as Kaz Clark and her neighbours saw the strange pyramidal structure at Penter. I went and visited this location. There's broken stumps, there are cracked trees, and this is a view from the other side. There are lots of broken trees like that. There's another one, and some of them have pink scorch marks on them as if they have been subjected to intense radiation or heat, and that's something I'll talk about later in another case. This apparently is, I took this photograph and Gary told me he's not sure if that actually was the cause of the problem that happened here. But it's as if something large crashed there, something came down in those woods, which generated a lot of radiation or heat, but also it seemed to have some kind of mechanical effect on the trees, as if it actually damaged the trees physically. I don't know what it was, but anyway, about a week later they opened it up and people went in. And how am I doing for time, Peter?
5 minutes more.
Okay, I'll end with this case and I'll go on to the next case in the next part. Sure. Okay, so very, very odd indeed that. After the break, I'm going to talk about another case, the Nottinghamshire Roswell, which is very similar. And again, it may well be one you've not heard of before, but if so, well, you will now.
The questions from
Yeah, what am I doing? Just a little bit.
My CV, also, we'll carry on.
Yeah, I'm all set. If you're all ready.
Yes.
Thanks hope you enjoyed your break. Now we're going to go back to, right, we're going to talk about another case now, which has many similarities to the Penter incident, curious similarities. This is something I've been dealing with for a while, and it happened much earlier than the Penter incident. It happened in 1987. It's called the Nottinghamshire Roswell, at least that's what I've called it. But previously it was called the Mansfield Incident, and it was reported in several journals, including Nexus magazine. I'll come to that in a minute. But the Nottinghamshire Roswell is essentially like, I say it's like Roswell. Now, this is a book, actually. This is a very interesting book which I read as a research when I found out about what happened in the Nottingham area in 1987. Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology by Ryan S. Wood, forward by the late, great Jim Mars, who investigated the Aurora incident, which is another. It's very difficult to get hold of this book now. It's quite rare. I had to borrow one from a friend. But it talks about a number of incidents similar to the Roswell incident. The Roswell incident happened in July of 1947, and what happened was an extraterrestrial artifact, I believe it was that, it was a flying saucer, a spacecraft, crashed on the Earth's surface and was secretly salvaged by the government. They cleared away all the decisive evidence that had been left behind, which included wreckage, pieces of this craft, and bodies of biological entities, aliens. And they sealed off the area, they cleared away all the decisive evidence, and then they put out a cover story afterwards, and then they opened up the area, they let people back in, they put out a cover story about what it had been. And they put out more than one, actually. It started with a weather balloon, then it moved on, they changed their minds about 3 times about what it actually was that crashed in July of 1947 in New Mexico, USA. What Ryan Wood here has actually discovered in his research, and indeed I have too, is that what happened in Roswell was not unique. It wasn't even the first time it happened. In fact, Jim Mars investigated a case that happened in 1897. And there's been a number since. I mean, this book actually details 100 events within the 20th century, which means, on average, 1 per year. He doesn't mention the Nottinghamshire case, though, which is odd. That's come to light more recently. So what happened at Roswell is actually a regular event, and in fact, Roswell is a name. It's a name of a town in New Mexico, and but I think at some point it's going to become like a common noun. It's going to become a name for something, a word for something, a common noun for other types of events like this. And indeed, you already heard phrases like the Brazilian Roswell, the Welsh Roswell, the Russian Roswell. I think this is the Nottinghamshire Roswell I'm talking about today, because it's similar. And again, you have, it's as if, even by the time Roswell took place, you see the same signs that I talked about with the Penter incident, that the government were already familiar with this kind of situation by 1947, and they already had procedures in place to deal with it. This wasn't, oh my God, what are we going to do? Let's think of something quickly. This was, guys, go in and sort it out again. This was reported in the this edition of Nexus here from 1997. This actually, I actually managed to get a copy of this online on they got a DVD-ROM of all the old copies. And this is reported by someone called Harry Mason in this particular edition. Now, this was, Harry Mason is a researcher from Australia, and he managed to dig up this story from Skywatch, which is an very old e-zine. It's actually pre-World Wide Web. It was out on Usenet and all these other World Wide Web networks that were out and about. And it was edited by a guy called John King. I actually know this man, and he used to edit this, and he reported on this event happening way back then, although I don't think it's only recently. In fact, it's partly my own work that is where I think what actually happened has been connected directly with extraterrestrial activity, and I think that's what it was. It was October the 17th, 1987. It was a cold, clear night in autumn. Interestingly, it was the day before the Great Storm, which is, I don't know if there's a connection there, but the Great Storm was a hurricane that hit the British Isles and did devastation. It caused devastation across the country. But on this particular night, it was calm and it was clear. And some lights appeared in the sky above an area north of the city of Nottingham. in what's now, today it's called the Nottingham conurbation, which is basically a group of towns around, especially to the north of the city of Nottingham, which is in England, and it's got quite a large population. There's some very, very large towns there. People heard, first of all, there's lights appeared in the sky, and then there was a huge explosion, but really loud, which caused it caused a vibration. There was a vibration as well, which caused damage to buildings. It was that loud over a wide area, a very, very wide area indeed. In fact, you see on the map here, I've drawn a circle here with the help of some local researchers to actually indicate what we're talking about here. This is the area on the map where we're talking about. That there is Mansfield, which is a large town in Nottinghamshire, to the north of the city of Nottingham. There's Nottingham there, the largest city in the area. And it happened in this area here. And within this area here, these are the people who heard the sounds, according to these researchers I spoke to. As far away as here as Hucknall, Blyth, and up here to the north by Mansfield. So this is an area of a few dozen square miles, and indeed in 1987 there were 11,000 people living within this circle in these various large towns, Kirkby in Ashfield, Sutton in Ashfield. The lights appeared in the northeast of this area. That green spot to the east of Mansfield is Sherwood Forest of Robin Hood fame. And they travelled in a southwesterly direction across here, and this area here, which is called the Misk Hills, which is a rural beauty spot. And this is where, and there's some areas, especially this green spot here, which is called Thieves Wood, and a place near the M1 motorway called Annesley Hall, where some interesting things happened. Following the bright lights moved around in the sky, they made strange noises. There was the explosion. We know that there was numerous witnesses to this. In fact, one of the witnesses that came forward and there were two people. There was an insurance broker in the local area who was inundated with the calls because people damaged under people's houses, windows broken, TV aerials snapped off, the chimney pots coming off the houses, things like that from this blast, from the shockwave. And also there seems to be some kind of electromagnetic pulse because a large number of television sets and video recorders broke down. And again, a video recorder, if you're below a certain age, you won't know what that is. But you have to imagine iTunes in a black plastic brick. Right, that's a VCR. But these broke down and they had to be repaired. And there was another person who came forward and spoke out and said it was strange, was a TV repairman. Now, the event happened at about 2 o'clock in the morning, in the early hours of the morning. By 2:45 in the morning, for some reason night time seems to be the middle of the night seems to be a popular time for these things to appear. There were helicopters like this overhead. This isn't a photograph from the event, this is just a reconstruction. It's a common thing in England now. The police use them and they have spotlights shining down and things like that. Very rare in those days. But there were helicopters overhead shining lights down on the ground as if there were people searching for something. And indeed, some people identified these as military helicopters, although there were none. The nearby air bases, they flew out of the nearby air bases. This is RAF Cranwell and RAF Coningsby. Although these helicopters were not normally based at these particular locations, so they'd been moved there. The helicopters had been moved there before this happened. Again, as if the government knew they would be needed before the event happened. And that's very important. Again, we see this foreknowledge, this almost precognition. Somehow they knew in advance something strange was going to happen. Not the exact spot, but the rough area where it was going to happen. This is the Nottingham Post website, and they actually reported that several of these witness statements actually were put into the Ministry of Defence. Indeed, this was in the pre-Nick Pope days, but the file releases that have happened, these witness reports that have recently been declassified by the government, which Nick Pope has talked about, and Dr. David Clark has talked about, the reports are actually here, and this article is called "The Truth is Out There, Near Mansfield." And it asks, have aliens visited Mansfield? I remember that, I haven't got the whole article here, but you can find it, and it talks basically about what happened on that night. Though it doesn't go into the details that I'm about to tell you. It's only some local researchers who actually discovered some of the other details we're talking about here. This is Thieves Wood. It's a big forest just to the south of Mansfield, between Nottingham and Mansfield. this road here is the A60, and it's the principal road that links Nottingham and Mansfield, the two biggest towns in that area. When I found out about this, I got together with a local researcher, and we took a little trip around there. We went to the wrong place at first. We went up to the north here, but then I was contacted by another guy who told me, no, you're looking in the wrong place. The actual place where something strange happened, because something strange did happen, is here. Do you see there's like a ball patch there? I'll show you in greater detail. First of all, these are the two guys I have to credit with researching this case. These are two local men who actually live in Kirkby and Ashfield, and that's Daniel Bostock and Nigel Crowley. And they remember this from when they were kids, because they were children at the time, but they remember this happening. They remember the electricity was cut off. Again, that's a sign of electromagnetic pulse of some kind. Some people have speculated this was a nuclear weapon detonation above the town, but it doesn't appear that way. There was no heat effects, which you'd get with a nuclear explosion, no radioactive fallout or anything like that. But these guys remember the electricity being cut off for weeks, and indeed the water pipes were damaged, and they had to bring bottles of water around for people to drink and things like that. It was a very, very strange time indeed. This is like the cordon area around which this was sealed off. They told me, Nigel and Dan told me, that this whole area was sealed off for a week, including this road here. The A60 was completely and utterly closed. And they said that the traffic that normally goes between Nottingham and Mansfield along that big main road had to go to the east, had to go around the town called Blidderth, which is a tiny little village, and other little places like that, was diverted, which caused massive traffic jams. A man I met actually in 2016 he was actually used to be a lorry driver, and he told me he remembered this diversion. He said it lasted a week, and you couldn't go on the A60, you couldn't go anywhere in this area. That's Kirkby and Ashfield there. Down here is Ravenshead, and up here was the West Nottinghamshire College of Mansfield. So if you wanted to get from Kirkby to Ravenshead, you had to be diverted because this road was shut. Very strange indeed. This is a closer look at Thieves Wood. This is the woodland we're talking about. And you can see here, this is all like trees that are just grown and they're cut down and they're used for paper and things like that. This is the first crash site in Thieves Wood, where an object struck the ground before briefly taking to the air once more before coming to rest at the Warren. I'll tell you more about the Warren in a minute. But this is the interesting area we're going to talk about now. This is a Google Earth image taken around about 2001, and you can see, unlike most of the rest of the area, it's bare. Most of the other locations are actually grown over. This is Forestry Commission land. This is land going to waste, which they could use, but they decided that it's bare. They took away everything from there. So Nigel, Dan and I took a little walk to this location. Now, since that photograph was taken, there's been a little bit of regrowth. You can see some small bushes, you can see some trees that are starting to sprout up, and in the background you see some bigger trees. Those are trees that were there before the explosion in 1987, and they're much bigger. In fact, I counted a few rings where they've been doing some felling, and there were trees that were up to 50, 60 years old, which means they were already mature trees when this event happened, but these trees were far enough away not to be affected. What we're saying is that something struck the ground, like at Smilog Woods in 2016. Some large object, we don't know how big it was, we don't know what shape it was, we don't know anything about it except that it was large enough to do have mechanical effects on the trees. In other words, to knock the trees down, but also it started a fire. It actually started a forest fire, and fire crews were called in from a long way away, as far away as Bingham, which is to the east of Nottingham, in the Rushcliffe district. It is a long way away from that area. Now, it's hard to say that anything strange has happened now. As you can see, it's regrowing. Maybe in another few decades you wouldn't know that there's something weird that happened there. But there are some long-term effects on this location, and there remains, as Nigel said, that there are marks on some of the trees, some of the trees that survived, which indicates that something happened to them in terms of heat and indeed being damaged, physically damaged. I also noticed that there's a lot of sand in this area. Now, Nigel told us that when the army moved in there in 1987 for a week, they occupied that area, the area inside the Red Line for a whole week. They dumped a lot of sand on this area. They removed a lot of topsoil. They took away not just the trees and the remains of the trees, but the topsoil. Why they did this, it's I don't know. They've done similar things in other locations, such as Roswell. This could be for several reasons. Firstly, it's possible there was evidence within that area, such as fragments of an object which broke off. Indeed, this happened at Roswell. Or and they wanted these things removed so that people couldn't find them. Or it was possibly there was some kind of contamination involving some kind of chemical contamination, or maybe even the fear of biological contamination, some kind of alien disease. And we're getting into the area of horror movies now, you know, The Thing. I mean, you never know. I mean, it's obviously that's an extreme example, but this could be a concern of theirs. So the topsoil, tons of topsoil were removed and replaced by sand. And indeed, the area is very sandy. And I actually I noticed that, and I moved into the trees behind to look at the soil there, and I could see that the soil was of a different consistency. It was brown. There was very little sand there. It was more muddy. Here's a better view here. You see that there's a fence along the bottom here, and I don't know when that fence was built, but it runs lengthwise across this clearing. The clearing is about 600 by 300 feet, this oblong clearing. And it's quite damp at the bottom. There's some mud, and it's sandy mud at the bottom. It's almost like there's a slight dip in the land. I mean, the area is very flat, but there's a slight depression in the land, as if there has been digging and excavation there, or something made a hole. You can't tell. This was a long time ago, 1987, but there were still signs that something strange happened there. Now, after what I think happened when Nigel and I have looked at into this, because this is another view of the area. There's Kirkby there, Annesley, which is another town, the Hollingwell Golf Course. Now, what happened? We believe happened is that that there is the clearing. Whatever it was that hit there took off again and flew this way to the southwest across the Hollingwell Golf Course, and it came down at somewhere called the Warren here, which is it's down here, sorry, which is in this area here. Here's a closer look at that area. Now this crescent-shaped road runs along here to the junction. This is junction 27 of the M1. The M1 is the longest motorway in Britain. It goes all the way from London to Yorkshire in the north of England. And what happened right next to this junction. It's very interesting. This motorway was not shut at the time, which is a very, very interesting thing. But Nigel believes that something landed here, the Warren it's called. This is in the grounds of Annesley Hall, which is a 13th century stately home. It's a very old building, and most of it's derelict now. It belongs to the original Sheriff of Nottingham, incidentally, interestingly. They had the Annesley, the Chayworth family, that owned it for about 300 years, and they lost it in a poker game or something. It's just derelict now. But these grounds here are the grounds of Annesley Hall, which are still it's still private land. It's owned by whoever owns Annesley Hall. We don't know who now, and you can't go on it. And the Warren here is an area of that where there's some lakes, where there's some fish, and sometimes poachers try to get in and fish and they can't. And you see there's a black mark on the land. And this is very, very strange in this field. This is an arable field. There is a farm nearby, and they do grow things. They do grow crops here, and things seem to grow normally. You can't see anything strange from ground level, but you see there is a dark blotch on the ground there. You can see from this Google Earth image. Now, this discoloured ground cannot be seen anywhere else within miles, and I looked over the rest of the area, and I can't see anything like it for miles and miles and miles and miles. I don't know what that is, but it's possible that something, whatever landed there, or crashed there, had some kind of permanent effect on the land, on the ground. And we've seen something similar. We've seen this happening somewhere else. I mentioned at Penter, something happened which killed the trees and the bushes, where the presence of this UFO did damage. So it almost like sucked the life out of the area. And indeed, in Rendlesham Forest, Peter Robbins did some research on Capel Green, the field, where Larry Warren and several other people saw a strange object appear, and that there is again you see there's some strange changes to the ground, to the land, as a result of this happening. And that mark, that dark discoloured patch, could be something related to that. Now, so of course we went to see that. Dan and Nigel and I, and my former partner Sue and a couple of other people, we went on an expedition to see what we could find out at this location. Now, we found something interestingly. I don't know if there's a connection here, but there's an old nuclear bunker on this road, just about there. This is a big industrial estate here, and there's some shops and things. And there's a nuclear bunker. It's an old, which they used in the Cold War. I don't know whether it would have been active at the time, because that was during the Cold War. But not sure whether it had anything to do with this particular event. And we went up a footpath. I'll show you where the footpath runs. It's called the Dog and Bear Lane. And it runs, where are we now? Sorry. Dog and Bear Lane, you can just see there. This is a footpath that runs from this road here to this road there, and you can just walk up there and you can't take a car. So we took a walk up there to see what we could find. And I took some photographs there. There's the old ruins of Annesley Hall. And we looked across this area where there's a big fence, you can't get into it. And the funny thing is, there's very tight security there. Now, a lot of private land in countryside does have security personnel, gamekeepers mostly. These are just men usually employed to fend off poachers or to tackle poachers, and if they catch one, they'll call the police and things like this. Because people, very often in the countryside, people go onto the land, and like I mentioned, in the Warren there's a pond where there's fish, and sometimes people will go and fish illegally in this pond to try and catch fish. Things like that. But it appears that there's not much poaching goes on there now, but there's still a large 24-hour security service there, including people in cars. And now this is that's Nigel's hand there, pointing towards the Warren. Now, those trees there, it's just in front of those trees there, that discoloured patch is where we believe something strange happened. Something strange came down to the ground at that point. Now this is as close as you can get to it. There's a big fence. Indeed, you can't see it in this picture, but there's a fence in front of us as well. A barbed wire fence, which means you can't go onto that land. It's private land. The only people who go on there are basically the owners of the Annesley Hall estate and the farm, the people who work there on the farm. No one else can get on there. And they say security is very tight. Now, strangely enough, as we were walking along Dog and Bear Lane, this car appeared. It drove right up in front of the newest part of Annesley Hall, which is still active. It's the old servant and guest quarters, which is near to Dog and Bear Lane. And the car stopped. Sorry, it's not a very good image here. This is like a still from the video I made. But they wowed down the window, and even at that distance, I could see these people were staring at us. They were staring at this group of about 5 or 6 people walking up this lane and filming and taking photographs of the Annesley Hall land, and they were concerned by that, even though we were on public land and we were in full display. This was the middle of the day. So obviously we're not poachers. Poachers usually operate at night. And they stared at this. I think they were trying to intimidate us. This car has a mark on this side, which is the mark at the livery on the side of the car is the land management agency that runs the estate. Now, Nigel actually phoned up the land management agency a couple of years ago, and he tried to get some information, firstly on who owned Annesley Hall now, and on the nature of the security and things like that, on who these people were. And he didn't mention UFOs, he just pretended to be doing it for, I think he made up an excuse, like he was doing a survey or something for a college. And they put the phone down on him, they wouldn't speak to him. They wouldn't speak to him at all. It's odd that there's all these strange, everything goes, the shutters come down whenever you ask reasonable questions. For example, Kaz and Gary, they asked about, in the Penter Incident, they wanted to know about who the strange people were wandering around in the red jackets, the Vodafone people, or the fracking people. They wanted to know about what the aircraft were doing, and the Ministry of Defence replies, Section 26, not in the public interest. So even if you use the Freedom of Information Act request for things like that, they won't reply. Which interestingly explains another reason why that wasn't a military exercise which happened in Penter. It's another reason why sometimes when you start asking certain questions of certain people, like the particular land management agency, which is a public company, it's a public-facing company, they've got no reason not to talk to a member of the public, they just refuse. And this is, I think it may be connected with what happened in 1987. There may be some reason why they still don't want people around there. This area, according to Nigel, was sealed off for a whole week at that same time. So you have this little link road here from the junction 27 and the M1, and it goes right over to Linby there, lovely Danelaw name that. And then you come down here. This is the outer skirts of Hucknall, which is a big town just north of the city of Nottingham. A large area, completely sealed off. You couldn't go in, you couldn't go out. Although the M1 motorway remained open. Now, we were very curious to see if, presumably, if for some reason, obviously if there was a flying saucer lying on the ground and the motorists going up and down this big motorway could see it, the government wouldn't be too happy about that. And they'd probably seal off the motorway and say there'd been a big crash or something. But the motorway definitely wasn't closed. We checked, and there's no record of any closures. So we took a little drive from junction 27 south to see what we could see from the motorway, and we couldn't see anything of this land to our left, to the east of the motorway, because there were large trees in the area. Now we don't know, those trees might have been recently transplanted because of carbon offsetting laws and green belt laws and things like we have in Britain. But it's possible those trees were there at the time. The trees obscure any view of anything on this side of the motorway, all along the area we're concerned about here. So all that area was sealed off. Again, this is a tree, one of the trees, an average age compared to by the size of the stumps, because I counted rings on some of the stumps. And they were about 60s, 70s, so 50 to 60 years old. They would have been around there. Nigel says there were permanent damage done to these trees as a result of the impact of this object and indeed the effects of the heat and possibly radiated heat and electromagnetic radiation. But obviously we need an expert to confirm that, a dendrologist, or whatever you call them, who deals with trees. So hopefully Nigel's working on that. Hopefully we're going to get some proper survey done. The Annesley Hall site is sealed off. You can't get near it. As I explained, there's very tight security there. If you try to get into it, you'll probably be arrested and handed over to the police if you're lucky. It's like Area 51, you know. But the Thieves Wood site is open to the public. You can go there any time and check it out. This is an interesting picture, isn't it? Now, believe it or not, this I just googled flying saucer crash in a city, and I came up with this. Still, this is from a computer game, Grand Theft Auto 5. I'm not a gamer, as we say in English. I don't play many computer games, but I might play this just to see what this is all about now. You see, a very strange thing. This is a crossroads in a big city, and so it's Copenhagen. It looks a bit like Copenhagen, actually. And a large flying saucer has come right down in the middle of the city, and they just crashed in front of everyone, in front of a large centre of population. And this is what the debunkers tend to say. Is they always bring this subject up. They say, well, how come whenever a UFO crashes, how come it always crashes in some remote location, isn't it? It's always the Devil's Armpit, Nevada, isn't it? It's always like, oh, it's Roswell, it's right in the middle of the desert. Oh, it's on a Welsh hillside somewhere where no one's around. How come, why don't they just come down in the middle of a city where we all can see it and where they can't cover it up? But that never happens, does it? That's because it's not real, it must be. Well, there's two answers to that. The first is that why should? Seeing as we've only been monitoring these crashes, we only know of crashes dating back to the late 19th century. If any happened before then, they've not been reported. But when you consider the actual density of human population on the Earth, there's a lot of us around. I mean, there's was it 7 billion? I don't know who counts them. It comes with quite a job. But there's about 7 billion of us on this little planet of ours. We tend to be concentrated in sort of small areas, and it's not in a densely populated area. People who live in these densely populated areas, it's hard to imagine. But here in Copenhagen, for example, there's millions, a couple of them, I don't know how many people live in this city, but there's a large number of people, thousands, living in a small area. Same with Oxford, same with London. In Britain, there's actually almost, I think there's almost 65 million people. And we're all living on an island, or a group of islands, where there's 255,000 square miles. So Britain and Denmark, indeed, are very densely populated countries by global standards. With other countries, it's different. With other areas of the world, it's different. Human population is much more sparse. In fact, if you look at the entire Earth's surface, almost 3/4 of it is water. It's almost 3/4 of it is covered by the sea. Of the remaining, I think 30%, half of that land surface is almost totally uninhabited. Nobody lives there. It's either too hot, it's too cold. Because there's no point living there because you can't keep warm, or you can't keep cool. There's no water. There's all kinds of other reasons why you can't have large-scale human habitation. So again, that really, you have to come down to 15% of the entire Earth's surface for any sizable human population of any kind. And when it comes to large cities, that's even smaller. You're probably looking at maybe a couple of percent of the entire Earth's surface is populated to the extent you see here. So it's when a UFO crashes, even if it's one per year, as Ryan Wood was saying, it's unlikely this is ever going to happen. It could happen, but the odds are against it happening very, very often, where something comes down on that little 1 to 2%, which is densely populated like this. But the second answer to that, the debunkers' point there, when they say, well, how come they never land in the middle of a city, is they do. Things like this do happen in the middle of a city. I mean, how many of you have heard of the Varginha incident in Brazil? Anyone heard of that one? 1996? Yeah, that was a very interesting case. It was a town of about 100,000 people, and there was a UFO came down just outside it, but aliens were wandering the streets. It's an amazing case, and I've looked into this, and I think there was something really weird going on there. So that does happen, and of course the debunker will say, well, if that happened, it would be all over the news, wouldn't it? Everyone would know about it. You couldn't keep this secret because people would be walking along and they'd see this flying saucer there in front of them. So therefore, the secret would be out. Unfortunately, I've got to disagree with that, and it's a sad fact. But the people in government know an awful lot about human psychology. They know what makes us tick up here. They've been studying us for a long time about how we think and how we feel, and how our thoughts and feelings can be manipulated, and indeed our memory can be manipulated, and our actions therefore can be manipulated. So, which means that if the media is a controlled media, which is designed to produce false information, to give false information to disinform us, rather than information to inform us, I suspect, sadly, that in a situation like this, they would find some way to wriggle out of it. They would say, when this happened, people would be walking along and they see this flying saucer there. And they go home and they see a news story which said, something, it's like a novelty story at the end when all the serious stories are over. A large bouncy castle at a children's party or at the Tivoli Gardens or something. It suddenly flew up into the air, it was caught by the wind, and it landed at the crossroads. It's a little novelty fairground ride, looks a little bit like a flying saucer. And it's landed there. The people at Tivoli Gardens are very worried they're going to come and collect it soon. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, sorry about that, just a freak bit of wind. Now, the answer is, of course, anyone who saw this with their own eyes would know that was wrong, but is it possible that a large proportion of the people who saw that news story after witnessing this would be able to somehow convince themselves that what they saw wasn't true? I wonder how many of those people actually would be convinced it wasn't true, because there's psychological research that shows this is frighteningly easy to convince people that something they saw with their own eyes is not true. Therefore, if this does happen, if they covered it up in the Nottinghamshire conurbation, where there's 11,000 people, there's large towns, is there anywhere where they couldn't cover up a UFO crash like this? I suspect no. I like to think otherwise, but I suspect no. So, now Harry Mason's theory about this is it's some sort of weapon. There's two possibilities. This was the Cold War. It's possible that this was a British weapon test, in which case that doesn't quite make sense. This is like some science fiction weapon. That's, during the Cold War they were developing things such as lasers and Star Wars, as it was called, the Strategic Defence Initiative. In which case, though, why test it in the heart of England in a populated area when there's places like Area 51 where you can take it? And indeed, Britain has its own equivalent of Area 51. There's a place called Porton Down and Boscombe Down, which are secret military bases. There's also the Defence Training Estate at Salisbury Plain, which is vast. It's about 100 odd square miles, which is completely and utterly sealed off to the general public, which is used by the army for training, but it can be used for other things as well. So I doubt if it was some sort of weapon, or was it perhaps a Soviet weapon? It was the Russians were firing a weapon at Britain as part of the Cold War. I don't know, because this was the Cold War, wasn't it? Do you recognise this chap? Mm-hmm. Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was the last president of the Soviet Union. Now, when he came to power, a lot of things changed. What happened basically was the presidency of this man, in a sense, ended the Cold War. He began, in a sense, with the Cold War wound down. Indeed, from the mid-1980s onwards, by 1987, when this event happened, there was what was called Perestroika and glasnost, as he called it. These were Russian words that mean restructuring, openness. He wanted to transform the Soviet Union into a very, very different kind of country, one that could be perhaps survive, because he knew that the system as it existed could not continue. So he tried to transform his country into something different, and he succeeded too well, or he failed, depending on how you look at it. But the Soviet Union actually collapsed during this period, and indeed, officially by the end of 1991, it was disbanded and transformed into the modern Russian Federation. But one of the things he wanted to do as part of his presidency was basically make peace with his Cold War enemy. And this included Britain, which was an ally of the United States. Indeed, Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time this man was Soviet president for most of his presidency. And they were good friends. He attended her funeral a couple of years ago and she died. It seems unlikely that he would actually order an attack using any kind of weapon, whether it was conventional or an experimental one, against Britain, or even testing it over Britain, or doing anything in British airspace that would lead to anything other than his attempt at rapprochement, to create this kind of armistice within the Cold War. So I find that very unlikely. What Harry Mason's theory doesn't make sense. So what else does that leave? Well, you have to think, this is kind of like logic here. It was actually Arthur Conan Doyle, and he said the words through his character Sherlock Holmes. When you've eliminated everything else, what you have left has to be the truth. So, oops. Was it something extraterrestrial? That's the third possibility, and I think that's the most likely possibility. Using Occam's razor that the skeptics love. What's more likely is it something, and I've explained why it can't be a weapon, I don't think. It certainly wasn't a helicopter crash, which is what the BBC, according to Dan Bostock, the BBC reported a helicopter had crashed in the woods. You'd just have a bobby on the beat and some tape around it, wouldn't you? You wouldn't seal off the area for a week for a helicopter crash. So I think it was something extraterrestrial at the Nottinghamshire. Now, Britain's an amazing country. Please do visit Britain at some point. Have any of you been there? I know, Pierre, you've come over there. Oh, cool. If you haven't been there, do get over there at some point. You have to do it quickly because when Brexit happened, there's going to be a big wall all the way around this. And no one will come in and no one will go out ever again. But it's called the UK, but I think it should be changed. I think you should reverse those letters and call it KU, which is Kingdom of UFOs. Because I think it deserves to be called that, definitely. And if you want to know anything more, if you're really into UFOs and you like the subject, you couldn't do better than reading these books. In all modesty, these books here, the Roswell trilogy, are a fiction. They're a fictional account, but it's allegorical fiction. It's like telling a story about the real world. And I asked myself, the reason I've written these books is because I asked myself, what if there was no cover-up? What if we had disclosure, exopolitics, crash retrievals, UFOs? If you like these sort of things, the subject you've heard about before, you'll probably enjoy these stories. It's a trilogy, it's the same story in 3 books. But thank you very much, all of you. I really appreciate you hosting me. It's been great. I've had a great time here. It's lovely to meet you guys. So thank you very much.
We have some.
Yeah. Right. How much time we got left?
We have a half an hour or more.
Okay. Oh, cool. So I can. What I've been doing is I've been recording what I've been talking about. Is it alright if I continue recording, or does anyone not want me to? Is it alright with everyone if I just record what I say the next part? Is that alright with everybody? Okay, so I will do that.
Just be careful.
Yeah, sorry, this is all audio only.
Where you got a camera in the corner. So.
Oh yes, we're being watched. Yeah. Well, I'm a dangerous dissident, you know. They let me into the country. Okay, I'm just one moment. Sorry. Won't be a sec.
No rush.
Oh yeah. So, would anyone like to ask me a question about anything? What you've heard today, or anything more, Pia?
The area, Nottingham or whatever it was, that had been sealed off, the place you could go to, has anyone taken a metal detector and checked the area?
Not to my knowledge, but that's one thing that could be done. And indeed, you could do EMF readings, and because Gary Jones has actually done. He's used electromagnetic frequency detectors on the Penter area and Smilog Woods, and he's detected anomalies in that area. So, actually talking to Gary and several other people about maybe, it's a question of getting the money together and getting the people together, but perhaps doing that kind of survey, getting it done properly in that area. Yeah, good idea.
Just going out in a big group and provoke those security people to come out and see what happens.
Well, we could do it. Go to the Warren as well and see what happens. But the Thieves Wood area, anyone can go to. It's public. So you can walk down there anytime.
Just to find out more.
Go to the local club that has this and ask them to go in the area. They have all the equipment.
I know a chap actually who's into metal detecting. Hopefully he might be able to. I've asked him if he wants to get involved. So I know he was involved in the Bedouin Mountains case. So hopefully he might be willing to help us out. Yeah, it's just a question of getting all together, getting the time and finding the time to get everyone together. That's a good idea, Peter. Yeah.
There's also somebody who went to rent some forest and did some measurements.
Yeah, that's Peter Robbins has done that, and several other people. There's a guy called Derek Savory who has been he's been very helpful because he's been researching Rendlesham since then on his own with his own team. There's him, Brenda Butler, and who's one of the original researchers, and they've discovered some really interesting things about that area. Good idea, Pia. Yeah, thanks. Anyone else got a question or comment?
I'm jumping
Pia,
to
the other Pia.
Yeah, I'm jumping to Winston Churchill. It's funny. Well, do you know the contents of those letters he wrote to the newspaper? Because he's contradicting himself.
He wrote.
If he says that this shouldn't be spoken about for about 50 years, and then he writes to newspapers, how come?
Well, he didn't write. He wrote earlier to newspapers, but he didn't write about UFOs specifically. He was writing before he became concerned that they were a serious event. He was writing specifically about extraterrestrial life, which included the possibility of life on Mars and Venus, which was interesting. He didn't. It seems that before the war, before World War II, he didn't seem to have any concept of alien life coming here, that it existed and came here. He thought that it might exist on other planets. And the letters that he wrote to the newspaper indicate that he understood the concept of, say, the Goldilocks zone, decided that liquid water can only exist in certain places in the solar system. If it's too close to the sun, it'll be vapor. If it's too far away, it'll be ice. Whether he had an interest before the war in UFOs or not, I don't know. But he was definitely involved after the war, possibly during it as well, because of the Foo Fighter reports. Thanks.
How much local media coverage was there of the Nottingham case and the first case you mentioned in the first part? Things like that. How much did they control the press?
Nigel actually went to look through some of the archives of the local newspapers, and he couldn't find anything from that area that time. It's possible that they exist and they're not published. They're not public, but he couldn't find anything at the time. As for the Penter, there was considerable media coverage, for example, in the South Wales Argus. In Wales Today. Kaz was actually interviewed in there's several newspaper reports you can actually find online if you put in Penter Ufo from Wales. I think it's Wales Today, where they do go into this case. They do mention it, yeah. But again, they don't really take it seriously. That's the problem. It's kind of brushed over. It's regarded almost as a frivolity. It's almost like a novelty story. This is often the way. I don't know if it's the same in Denmark, but in Britain certainly that's how the subject is portrayed nowadays.
And same in the US.
Yeah. As I said, it seems strange, but there seems to be a global policy on UFOs, especially with the crash retrievals. Because what Ryan Wood discovered in his book is not only that the crash retrieval phenomenon goes back a long time, but wherever it happens in the world, whether it's Britain, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Brazil, the same thing seems to happen. In various different sovereign states, the governments tend to respond exactly the same way. The cover-up, the secrecy, the fake stories, things like that. It's as if there is a global policy in place which most, if not all, sovereign states are obeying. So that's interesting. Indeed, even during the Cold War, it seems that there was the Soviet Union and its allies. There's a lot of evidence that the Soviet Union and its allies intercepted several craft and several pieces of decisive evidence, but they kept it under their hat as well. And it's almost as if this was some secret cooperation between two Cold War adversaries.
There's a document from 1971 where the Soviets and the Americans, they signed an agreement that they had to call each other or contact each other if there happened anything around their atomic weapons. And that was at the height of the Cold War also, so but they knew that something was happening close to their atomic weapons.
It's funny that doesn't surprise me at all, because there were several incidents with UFOs involving nuclear weapons. Indeed, Rendlesham Forest is a classic one, because that was the largest nuclear arsenal outside the United States on the western side. And there was a sightings there. I myself took a photograph near a nuclear base in Scotland, and I guess there was a saucer-shaped object appears in there. I didn't see anything at the time, but this distinct saucer-shaped object appears in this photograph. And there's lots of other, for whatever reason, these things, these beings, whatever they are, whatever that motivates them, we don't know, but they seem to have an interest in our nuclear weapon systems. And we saw this with a photograph of Elizabeth Templeton. And the Blue Streak missile, and indeed, you're familiar with Captain Robert Salas and his encounters. There were similar stories from nuclear launch facilities in the USSR. So there was even a very disturbing event where the opposite happened with Salas, because in the case of Captain Salas at the Maelstrom base, the presence of this UFO appeared to disable the missiles, whereas there was an incident in Russia at some point during the Cold War where the launch sequence inexplicably started on some missiles, and there was no orders came through, and the crew in the control room were trying to stop it, and they were panicking. They were saying, because they knew that if these missiles launched, they'd trigger a response, and there'd be annihilation, global annihilation, and so they managed to just at the last moment. But it appeared there were UFOs seen in that area at the time, which indicates the presence of these objects. Indicates the almost the near launching of these missiles. So that's really scary. That's far more frightening than...
Some recent incidences around the Maelstrom area.
Was there?
Yeah.
Oh, right, because there's still active missile launching facilities there, that's right. So it's still going on. I mean, there is still a nuclear standoff in the world today. It's greatly reduced from the Cold War level, but it's still enough to kill us all. And it's still the same. It seems to be the same kind of people as Russia, and Russia's been blamed for everything now. You know? It's almost like they're trying to get us into a second Cold War. I mean, if you lose your car keys, you know, Putin did it. It's literally getting that bad. So, you know, why they're interested in our nuclear weapons, I don't know. I mean, it could be that they certainly don't want us they're certainly monitoring our space exploration as well. And as Captain Bob Jacobs, who spoke at UFO Truth Magazine conference, he was involved he was a photographer, and who was actually involved in nuclear weapon missile tests. And these were one of the rockets he watched launch was destroyed by a saucer-shaped object, firing a beam of light at it, and it blew up, exploded. And there's some reports that the project was about they were trying to launch a rocket to the moon and detonate a nuclear bomb on the moon, which it seemed to trigger some kind of intervention from whoever's out in space. It's almost as if they're telling us to keep these things on our own planet. Yeah. If we're going to use them, we have to keep them on our own planet. And I mean, I wonder what would happen if ever came Thanks for coming, gentlemen. Much appreciated. What would happen if there was a launch situation where we were actually on the point of blowing each other up? Would the UFO step in and stop it? Whoever's behind them step in and stop it? I mean, I don't know. I hope so. I mean, it's not an excuse for us not to try and prevent these things happening ourselves. But if they're willing to come along and lend a hand, I won't stand in their way. So it's an interesting point, isn't it? Anyone else? Sir?
The Welsh case and the Nottingham case, you mentioned there was dead shrubberies, bushes, trees, clearings in the ground where there was nothing growing. Have any biological samples been taken of these actual trees, of soil samples, to test for radioactivity or perhaps other causes? Gary
has gathered some samples of specimens. He doesn't have the ability to actually do the tests. It's actually it'd be quite a difficult thing. It would cost a lot of money, and an amateur UFO group doesn't have those kinds of resources. But he's written to a couple of people perhaps to lend a hand, some people who do have those resources. Because that would be a very, very important next step of research. You're right, that, as Pia was saying as well, that would be a very, very important thing to do. But of course, most universities don't want to look at this sort of thing. And as far as the government go, they're interested, but they're not telling us. So hopefully there'll be an update on that. Yeah, because when these sort of experiments have been done, they often produce very remarkable results.
Yeah, like Rendlesham, I noticed there was higher than background radioactivity and the divots in the soil. And
yeah, exactly, yes. So it'd be very interesting to see, especially the Penter case, which is only 3 years old.
Yeah.
So it's probably the sooner the research can begin, the better. It's always the case. There's always sometimes there's this gap between one and the other. With Roswell, it was 30 years before Jesse met Stan. And that's where the story begins. But by that time, all the witnesses were dead. Some of them had moved away. The memories had faded, things like that.
This sealed off area in the Nottingham area in the Nottingham case, could it be that the topsoil from the other area has been dumped in that sealed off area?
I wonder. It's
That's why people are not allowed to go in, because they may measure that there are strange isotopes or even radioactivity in that soil.
I don't know. I mean, that could be a reason. I mean,
yeah.
If you can see how large that the area was, it was the area in Thebes Wood. It was like it was about 300 by 600 feet, and Nigel reckons they dug down at least a foot into the ground to get the soil out. So you're talking about tons of material.
It took a whole week.
Yeah, and over a period of weeks. So that's a large amount of material. I mean, if they haven't dumped it somewhere on public land, what have they done with it? They would have filtered it and checked it through, and it could be, I don't know. But that's a good question.
It's probably radioactive to some extent.
It may well be, yeah, because
There's
there's
strange isotope combinations and things like that.
radioactivity has often been associated with the presence of these objects, and I mean, maybe that's what's killed the things, like the trees. There's a gentleman back there saying scientific tests could tell if radiation damage had killed these trees. The presence of ionizing radiation on their cells and things like that. And but you see things as well in, like with the Cash Landrum case. You see that the two ladies who witnessed that strange incident, which happened at the same time as the Rendlesham Forest incident. Interestingly, they were affected by radiation from the which was very strange. That, yeah. Right.
I mean, even at the 9/11 incidents, they removed the rubble and the soil fairly quickly. I don't know if anybody knows where that was.
There was so little rubble.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Less
most of
than
it was
expected.
dust spread all over.
That's right, Dr. Judy Wood.
But the little debris that was left there on the side was moved away pretty fast.
It was very quickly shipped away, and
Nobody knows
where it went, people aren't sure. There's a few fragments remain, but
if you could do an analysis of that, you'd probably find that it would be radioactive as well.
well, yeah. I mean, Dr. Judy Wood has certainly looked at some of the effects of some of the material behind. It indicates some very, very strange properties. But it's suspicious that this was done, because it's a bad way. Considering this was a major crime scene, and that Whenever this happens in other locations, you'd think that the FBI and people would want to get involved. Certainly, you see the same thing with the crash of Lady Diana in the tunnel in Paris. That the whole area was swept clean within a few hours. If you or I had been in that car, it'd have been the accident investigators would have gone in. It'd probably be 12 hours or more before it would be made open.
But the point is that it's probably the same type of technology that was used. The explosion was caused by the same type of technology as Liner.
You see some with the directed energy weapons, the Hutchison effect. You see this with UFOs as well now sometimes. Yeah, much higher.
Yeah, because you showed Gorbachev, I've been following Dark Journalist on YouTube, and he's brought up several times where Gorbachev a few years ago was in a public forum with Charlie Rose, being asked some questions. Do you know about this?
No, I haven't watched those programs. I do like the Dark Journalist.
So Gorbachev was reminiscing about his contact with Reagan during the Cold, during those years, and how they were in Reykjavik, and Gorbachev mentioned that Reagan approached him privately, just with interpreters, translators, and he said to him, if there were aliens coming from space attacking us, would you help us? And Gorbachev was totally blown away by the question. Do you know about this?
I've heard. I think.
And Kissinger's he was in the audience.
Oh, he would be. Yeah.
And he just looked a little bit uncomfortable when this was brought up, and Gorbachev said, well, yeah, we would help you. And Reagan said, well, we would help you guys too. And
That's
plus the
interesting.
whole SDI situation started with Reagan, and what weapons were created there, and all the nuclear weapons that still exist, the hydrogen bombs. I think there's about 18,000 hydrogen bombs that still exist.
Still quite a lot, yeah.
That still exist. That could annihilate most life on the planet.
Exactly.
So in an instant.
That's interesting. I have heard about this. I didn't watch the Dark Journalist talking about this, but I heard about the incident you're talking about.
It's on YouTube. You can find it
Oh,
very
I'll
easily.
look at it now. You mentioned it, yeah. Because well, Ronald Reagan has often let slip a few things, perhaps that he shouldn't have, possibly because of he had a few mental problems. Obviously, it came out later in life.
Well, he loved UFOs too.
Yes, he knew Steven Spielberg, and they sometimes discussed Close Encounters and things like that. And he's mentioned a couple of times. He talked a lot with several people involved, and he mentioned at the United Nations a couple of times things like, how quickly would our differences dissolve and disappear if we were faced with a threat beyond this earth? It's like an Independence Day situation, isn't it? Because that's an interesting film. I mean, it's a very bad film, I think, but it's worth watching because it contains a few hints as if we're being driven, or there's propaganda there, predicted programming. For example, the film centres around the United States, and there's a couple of scenes which indicate it's a worldwide fight against the aliens. And you see one scene where there's an aircraft, two jet fighters are about to take off to intercept, try and attack these aliens. One is Israeli and the other is Iraqi. And this was just after the big Gulf War, and Saddam Hussein was launching missiles against Israel, things like this. And it indicates it's a kind of coming together thing as one, to fight the common enemy. And it sounds very positive, it sounds very progressive, but if you've got to come together to fight a common enemy, you need things perhaps like an authoritarian world authority, a global authority, to which nation states would be subordinate. Maybe a larger and more dictatorial version of the European Union, for example, because it's not enough for one country. 5 minutes, right you are. I've only got 5 minutes left, but that's an interesting point, Marcello, yeah. So thanks for letting me know about that. Did anyone else like to say anything? We've just got time for a couple more, maybe. Madam?
Yeah, maybe I missed it, but what was the official explanations for the explosions? I mean, from the authorities, there must have been some locals contacting the authorities, or what was that, these explosions?
Is this in the Nottinghamshire case? Or the Penter case?
Both.
All right, in that situation there, in the case of the Nottinghamshire case, there's been no explanation at all. It's basically a non-event. Even though thousands of people heard the explosions and a lot of people had their televisions damaged by it, and even their houses damaged by it. In Penter, the official explanation is there was a military exercise at the time, which is nonsense, which is a cover-up. So
the local just accepted that explanation without going further into it?
unfortunately, There are. I mean, I know that Gary Kaz and myself have looked into this, and we know it can't be true, for the reasons I've explained in terms of Penter. But obviously, there are a large number of people who will accept that as an explanation. They'll accept that as an answer, which is a shame, because I think if they think about it, they realise it's wrong. But I don't think a lot of people don't think about these things. They respond, they react. And again, we come into the psychology level and about how if you want the media to give people a certain message, and you know there are millions of people watching television, and you want them to give them a certain message to make them think and feel a certain way, and therefore behave a certain way, then you can do it, because we know that the media uses psychological experts. I've had personal encounters with a few of these people. It's not pleasant. I'll save that story for another time, but I've had personal encounters with psychological experts. They're very, very unpleasant people who did me a lot of damage.
So you can really get people to believe that was a non-event, even though there was a huge explosion.
The actual yardstick of UFO landings, which is often talked about by people like David Clark, the UFO landing on the White House lawn, if that happened and the aliens got out and they said hello, well, that would be proof that these things exist. But if you still wanted to cover it up, what if you said Baron Trump had his little birthday party and he had a bouncy castle, and it looked like an alien, and that's what you saw on the White House lawn. He invited all his friends round.
Yeah.
We know his birthday's not for 6 months, but look, we thought we'd get in there earlier. You know, Trump was going to be busy then, so we thought let him have his birthday party earlier. It's a sad thing to say, but a lot of people would accept that as an explanation, even though it defied what they said. You know.
And UFOs flew across the White House in 1952, July, twice,
That's
2
right.
weekends in a row, and just people forgot about it. I mean, the human attention span is less than a goldfish now.
It's awful. I mean, Mark Pilkington wrote a book called Mirage Men, which I've got a lot of criticisms of, and it does bring this up. He does make some good points in there about this, the relationship between people and the media, and indeed there was a cover story put out that this was some kind of, as if they were some kind of test of it was some kind of time and motion study almost of the armed forces protecting the US Capitol. And it was simply they put in a special thing which created false radar returns and things like this. But it's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. And Pilkington accepts this. It's nonsense. These things were seen, and they were actually seen.
Undskyld, jeg forstyrrer. Huset her er en del af lysfestivalen. Kunne jeg ikke få jer til at skrue de der store gardiner for, at lyset herude og giver
okay.
vindskin på det hele?
Ja, helt sikkert.
Så vil vi være glade.
Det kan du tro.
God aften.
Okay,
We've got time for one more.
yeah, sure. It's something to do with the lights in here.
Yeah, there's one more. We've got one last question. Sorry, we've been holding on. Anybody? Anybody's not asked one yet? If not, have you got one, Marcello? No one else has?
Well, I'll just very quickly say my background is psychology, and people are extremely easy to manipulate, extremely easy, and to do it on the massive scale like the CIA does, where they have nodes in the mass media. It's so easy to manipulate mass culture. And
I could talk. Yeah, I could do a
It's
whole
so
presentation on that. But Michael, you want to say something? I'll be quick, mate. Sorry.
Shields, have you any idea about who of your friends Shields are working for intelligence service? Not necessarily a woman one.
The idea that people are shelled. For everyone who's been accused of being a shell, including me, it's everybody has been accused by somebody else of being a shell. And I think there's too many accusations without evidence, and that is counterproductive. It just causes confusion. And the real shills, then, in a sense, are they operate under the radar. The signal is lost in the noise. Apart from Nick Pope, I wouldn't publicly state that he was a shill, because I think there's evidence that Nick Pope is. But privately, and between people, I will talk to you about who I think is off the record. But I will never say it publicly without evidence. Okay, so I think that's going to have to be it. Thank you very much, everybody.